the Taliban have recently celebrated their third year in power. To commemorate this, the Taliban threw a parade showcasing all the military equipment that was left behind by US and NATO forces. However, most people don't know this. But this parade represents much more than just the Taliban's reconquest of the country. It is indicative of all the terrible things the Taliban has done so far in Afghanistan, as well as show where their priorities lie when it comes to them governing Afghanistan. For starters, malnutrition is a big problem in Afghanistan, with millions of people facing acute food insecurity. In 2021, 14 million Afghans were deficient in food supplies, and the Global Hunger Index ranked Afghanistan at 103rd out of 116 nations, indicating a serious level of hunger. Then you pair this with droughts, inflation, as well as lack of jobs, has led to many good, honest, hardworking Afghans living below the poverty line. In addition to this, more than half of the population of Afghanistan is under the age of 25. This makes Afghanistan probably the youngest country in the world when it comes to demographics, and many young people tend to be very impressionable. Consequently, this leads to a lot of young people being coerced into joining the Taliban or other extremist groups that are currently in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, the Taliban have done absolutely nothing to solve any of these problems. Instead, they have decided to make important trade deals with their most powerful neighbor, China. The Taliban have signed multiple agreements with China to allow them to mine Afghanistan's vast mineral wealth. And in exchange for that, China will provide weapons, equipment, and vast surveillance technology. This will help consolidate their rule over a fragmented and destabilized Afghanistan. The United States has spent billions of dollars trying to nation-build Afghanistan, so it would not become another breeding ground for international terrorism. Yet that is exactly what it is becoming, and yet nobody is paying attention. In addition to this, the Taliban has severely restricted the rights of women in the country. I am sure by now, almost everybody knows this, but hardly anybody outside of Afghanistan knows about the vast amount of women who are being daily. And these are not just isolated incidents, but very common throughout the entire country. The National Resistance Front, or the NRF, has carried out multiple operations against well-known Taliban members, who have been known for Afghan women. The most sickening part about this, the international community is ignoring it. And to make matters even worse, Al-Qaeda has made a resurgence within Afghanistan. A new report warns Osama bin Laden's brother and sons may be among those heeding a call by Al-Qaeda's leadership to gather in Afghanistan. The killing of Al-Qaeda's leader in a U.S. drone strike in 2022 was hailed by Joe Biden as a moment of closure for the families of the victims of 9/11. Ayman al-Zawahiri, the man who replaced Osama bin Laden and who had direct involvement in planning the attack on the World Trade Center, had been traced to a home in Kabul almost 1 year after another militant group, the Taliban, took control of the Afghan capital. It is now 3 years since Afghanistan fell to Taliban rule following the withdrawal of NATO forces, a moment marked last week by militants parading captured and repurposed U.S. military hardware through Bagram Air Base, host to the last American presence in the country before their hurried evacuation. Experts say Zawahiri's presence in Kabul was significant if not unexpected, and that since his death many other senior figures within Al-Qaeda have followed him in relocating to Afghanistan, finding an environment that allows them to continue operating with minimal interference from the country's Taliban rulers. Al-Qaeda today is much diminished from the organization that carried out the 9/11 attacks, and recent U.S. intelligence reports argue the group is less of a threat in the region than the likes of ISIS. Nonetheless, its new leader Saif al-Adel, an Iran-based explosives expert, remains the FBI's most wanted terrorist, with a $10 million bounty on his head. Ahmad Zia Sarraj, who handled Afghanistan's intelligence operations as chief of the National Directorate of Security up until the fall of Kabul in August 2021, claims the Taliban has absorbed what is left of Al-Qaeda into a de facto coalition, with the two groups' leaders regularly engaging in talks in the capital. Between 2017 and 2018, Zia Sarraj led a crackdown on Al-Qaeda operatives. It saw more than 400 detained. During interrogations, he says, these captives described ongoing plots to target the West, being hatched by hundreds of commanders and fighters still in hiding. Soon after, the Taliban took everything, Al-Qaeda members brought their families inside Afghanistan. Zia Saraj, now a visiting professor at the War Studies Department at King's College London, tells The Independent. The biggest example was Zawahiri. When he was there in Kabul, and I have heard that many of them brought their families back to Afghanistan. And why not? This is the safest place for them on this planet. They are not just terrorist groups, they have families married into each other. Since it seized power in Afghanistan on August 15, 2021, the Taliban has moved not only to eradicate women's rights and access to school and the workplace, but also to downgrade the availability of formal education in general. This has left hundreds of thousands of children and young people vulnerable to recruitment by extremist groups. At the same time, the country is awash with weapons, leftovers of 2 decades of war. It's a very attractive place for them to be there. Now in Afghanistan, Zia Saraj says, their own world. A recent report posits that Osama bin Laden's brother, Abdullah bin Laden, and an unspecified number of his sons are among those who have returned to Afghanistan since the Taliban takeover. It was compiled by Lieutenant General Sami Sadat, a 3-star general who served as Deputy Chief of the General Staff in the Afghan National Army before the collapse of the NATO-allied Ashraf Ghani administration. Over the past 26 years, the Taliban have been the primary force sustaining al-Qaeda, providing protection to leaders like bin Laden and Zawahiri, and nurturing the next generation of terrorist leaders such as Abdullah bin Laden in Afghanistan, the report says. Sadat claims Fathullah Mansour, the head of the Taliban's Civil Aviation Authority, is a key point of contact for al-Qaeda within the new de facto regime. He is said to be the one who approves the time, location, and routes for senior al-Qaeda leaders, including bin Laden family members, living and traveling throughout Afghanistan. Sadat and Zia Saraj both spent years fighting the Taliban and are now based abroad, and it is impossible to verify their claims on the ground in an environment that is tightly controlled by the Taliban. But they both make the same point, that the West has lost focus on what is happening in Afghanistan, with active wars having since broken out in Ukraine and Gaza. Seeing all the activities in Afghanistan, it is moving in a very dangerous direction, warns Zia Saraj. Kaysa Lamdar, a German-based open-source intelligence researcher monitoring Afghanistan's satellite imagery and ground reports, says that while it is impossible to know exactly how many fighters al-Qaeda now has operating in Afghanistan, the threat the group poses has increased since the Taliban takeover. He says the most plausible places for al-Qaeda to find new footholds are in the mountainous provinces of Kandahar, Ghazni, Wardak, and Logar. These provinces were strongholds of the Taliban over the past couple of years, too. There were so many drone strikes in these places compared to the rest of the country. These are also the parts of Afghanistan where the sentiments against the former government of Afghanistan and the U.S. are very strong. Anti-U.S., anti-West sentiments are super strong there. Even in the past, the former government had only control of a few districts, not the whole provinces in these regions. He tells The Independent. They are close to Kabul too. Only 2 hours drive from Kabul, each of these provinces. One moment in June this year that should have served as a wake-up call to the West came with a public announcement by the Iran-based leader Adel of a new al-Qaeda recruitment drive. In it, he called for any fighters who wished to strike against Western interests to gather in Afghanistan. He issued an open invitation to all of their fighters and all of their affiliates and all of their supporters to come to Afghanistan, says Sadiq Amini, an expert in public diplomacy and international security who served with the U.S. Embassy till August 2021. To come to Afghanistan, to get ready to train and plan for them to conduct attacks on the U.S. and their interests in the region. That call would not have happened without the approval of the Taliban's supreme leader Hibatullah Akhundzada. It wouldn't be possible for them to issue such an open invitation without it, says Amini, a non-resident fellow at the Observer Research Foundation in Washington, D.C. Resistance fighters who continue to oppose the Taliban regime in Afghanistan have for some time been warning of a repeat of a 9/11-style attack on the West if terror groups are allowed to flourish in the country. The National Resistance Front, led by Ahmad Massoud in exile, has been traveling to world leaders in Europe and the U.S. to warn of the threat simmering in Afghan provinces. Ali Maisam Nazari, the NRF's foreign relations chief, tells The Independent that these warnings are not just bluffs and empty words, they are actual warnings for the Western leaders. It's based on intelligence and credible information that we have on the ground and we see every day. It's not only al-Qaeda, it's different groups in the Afghanistan playground. We've estimated 21 small, regional, and international terror networks who have been building themselves since August 2021, he says. Last month, a U.S. State Department watchdog found that vetting failures may have allowed as much as $293 million of American aid funds to have fallen into the Taliban's hands in the past 3 years. That's out of a total of $2.8 billion in humanitarian aid that the U.S. has continued to provide to help the people of Afghanistan. The NRF has compiled a petition to the U.S. government, urging it to pause aid funding until it can be guaranteed it is not benefiting the Taliban regime. Thank you for watching this video. Please like and subscribe, and if you have time, please leave a comment.